I got lucky with this album. There's some really, really special songs in there, and so it's like you dodge a bullet.
Neil Diamond has spent 6 decades as the voice of a generation, selling out stadiums and creating the soundtrack to our lives. But behind the legendary sparkle and the iconic hits, the Brooklyn boy was fighting a private battle that finally forced him to walk away from the stage forever. The reason for his sudden exit is deeply personal and life-changing. Join us as we uncover the truth behind his final curtain call. The Brooklyn Sound. For Neil Diamond, the story of his music did not begin in a recording studio or under the bright lights of a stage. It began in the busy, noisy streets of Brooklyn, New York. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood, Neil was surrounded by a very specific kind of environment. To most people, Brooklyn was just a place of traffic, shouting neighbors, and the clatter of the elevated train. But to a young Neil, those sounds were not noise, they were the ingredients of a song. He often described his early years as being immersed in a hum in the air. In his community, being a professional musician or a songwriter was not seen as a realistic career path. It was a place where people worked with their hands and focused on paying the rent. Because of this, music was not a formal job he was looking for. Instead, music was a natural part of his surroundings. He heard rhythms in the way people walked down the pavement and melodies in the way the city breathed. This early environment shaped his Brooklyn sound style that felt grounded, gritty, and deeply human. As he grew older, Neil realized that his relationship with music was different from most. Many people want to be famous or have a successful career, which we call ambition. For Neil, it was not about wanting to be a star, it was a compulsion. This means he felt he had no choice but to create music. Melodies were a constant presence in his mind, almost like a biological function. He would lie in bed at night and hear tunes that did not exist yet. He could not turn them off or ignore them. This internal music was a permanent part of how his brain worked. It was a weight he had to carry until he could find a way to let it out. The turning point came when he finally held his first guitar. Up until that moment, he had all these feelings and melodies trapped inside him, but he did not have the words or the skills to share them. Picking up the guitar was a physical, tactile experience that changed everything. He described it as a moment where the instrument felt like it belonged in his hands. It was not just a piece of wood with strings, it was the key that unlocked his heart. The guitar gave him a way to speak without having to find the right words in a normal conversation. It allowed him to turn his private thoughts about love, loneliness, and hope into something other people could actually hear. For a quiet boy from a humble background, the guitar was the first thing that made him feel powerful. It was the bridge between the silent kid in Brooklyn and the man who would eventually move the entire world with his voice. Through this instrument, his internal compulsion finally found a physical home. Now that the music had a voice, it was only a matter of time before the rest of the world started to listen. Shaking with Destiny. Before Neil Diamond became a household name, he lived inside what he called a songwriter's shell. For years, he was content to stay in the background, writing songs for other people to sing. He was very good at this, but it felt like he was giving away pieces of himself. Every time he wrote a lyric, it came from his own feelings, his own heartbeat. Eventually, he realized that nobody else could capture the true emotion behind his words quite like he could. However, moving from the safety of a writing room to the front of a stage was a scary transition. He knew he had to do it, to be honest with himself. But the thought of being seen was overwhelming. This led to a period of stage metamorphosis. Neil was naturally a shy person who did not enjoy being the center of attention. When he finally stepped onto a stage to perform his own music, It was not a smooth or easy process. He was physically affected by his fear. His hands would shake so much that it was hard to play his guitar, and he would sweat through his clothes from the pressure. He didn't look like a confident star right away. Instead, he transformed into a performer through sheer persistence. He forced himself to stand there and be vulnerable in front of strangers. Over time, that nervous energy turned into the powerful stage presence that people eventually came to love. When it came to creating his famous hits, Neil did not follow a specific rule book or a commercial formula. Songs like Sweet Caroline and Song Sung Blue did not come from a desire to make a lot of money or top the charts. Instead, they were excavated from his own personal memories. To excavate means to dig something up, and that is exactly what he did with his past. Sweet Caroline, for example, grew out of a specific moment of innocence and happiness he had seen in a photograph. Song Sung Blue came from the simple idea that everyone feels sad sometimes, and singing about it can make a person feel better. He dug deep into his own life to find themes that were true to him, and because they were true to him, they ended up being true for millions of other people as well. But as Neil's star began to rise, he would soon find out that being a world-famous performer came with a whole new set of challenges. The showman arrives. As Neil Diamond's fame grew, the media began looking for ways to describe his massive popularity. One of the most common labels they gave him was the Jewish Elvis. While this was meant as a compliment to his charisma and his ability to draw huge crowds, Neil did not like the title. He felt that Elvis Presley was a completely different kind of artist. Neil did not want to be a version of someone else. He wanted to maintain his own authentic identity. He saw himself primarily as a storyteller and a songwriter who happened to be on a stage. By rejecting these flashy media labels, he made sure that his audience focused on the actual meaning of his lyrics, rather than a manufactured image. He stayed true to his roots as a kid from Brooklyn who just wanted to share his feelings. Being a superstar also changed his life in a very physical way through what he called the energy exchange. When he stood on a stage in front of 50,000 people, it was not just about singing songs. He felt a heavy responsibility toward every person in the audience. Each person brought their own memories, their own sadness, and their own happiness to the concert. Neil felt that he had to give them a piece of his soul in return for their attention and love. This meant that he no longer belonged entirely to himself during a show. He belonged to the public. It was a massive amount of pressure to carry, but it was also what made his concerts feel so special and personal for his fans. This intense connection created a feeling he described as being addicted to purpose. For Neil, performing was not about the money or the fame. It was about having a reason to get up every morning. He felt that his purpose in life was to be on that stage and to keep that connection with the world alive. Because he felt this so strongly, he entered a relentless touring cycle that lasted for 60 years. He worked harder than most people realized, often staying up all night to perfect a song or planning the next big tour, while other artists were taking breaks. He pushed his body and his mind to the limit because he could not imagine a life without that sense of duty to his music. But as the decades of constant travel and high-energy performances continued, his body began to send him signals that something was changing. Success has a price. While the world saw the bright lights and the grand performances, being a global superstar for 60 years came with a heavy physical toll. This toll was often hidden from the public eye. Traveling from city to city and country to country meant Neil Diamond spent a huge portion of his life in hotel rooms, airplanes, and dressing rooms. This created a deep sense of exhaustion that sleep could not easily fix. Beyond the physical tiredness, There was a specific loneliness between shows. Even though he was surrounded by fans and staff, the constant movement meant he was often away from his family and the comforts of a normal home life. He was living out of a suitcase for decades, which wore down his spirit and his body. The pressure was made even worse by his own internal expectations. Neil felt a crushing need to deliver what he called a perfect sparkle every single night. He knew that people paid their hard-earned money to see a high-energy showman, and he did not want to let them down. It did not matter if he was feeling sick, sad, or simply worn out. Once the lights came up, he forced himself to be the energetic version of Neil Diamond that everyone expected. He would push through pain and fatigue to make sure the audience left happy. This meant he was constantly putting the needs of the show before his own personal health. Eventually, Neil began to realize that this lifestyle was creating a growing bill. He had a drive to outwork everyone else in the music industry, but the human body has limits. Every night spent performing and every day spent traveling was like taking out a loan that he would eventually have to pay back. He started to recognize that his dedication to his career was demanding a payment from his physical well-being. He couldn't keep going at this speed forever without something breaking. The years of constant stress and physical effort were catching up to him, and the first signs of trouble were about to appear in a very quiet way. It all started with a small change in his hands that he tried his best to ignore. The first tremor. The change did not happen all at once with a loud bang. It arrived with very small, subtle warnings. For a man who had spent 60 years moving across stages with ease, the first sign was a strange new stiffness in his body. His movements were not as fluid as they used to be. The most concerning part was a slight tremor in his hand. At first, it was so small that only he could feel it. While holding his guitar, he noticed that his fingers didn't always land exactly where he wanted them to on the strings. This was a terrifying experience for someone whose entire life was built on the ability to play and perform with precision. Despite these warning signs, Neil Diamond entered a stage of early denial. He was a professional who had a showman facade to maintain, and he wasn't ready to admit that something might be seriously wrong. He came up with many different excuses to explain away his physical failures. He told himself that he was simply getting older and that everyone slows down eventually. He blamed the shaking on having too much caffeine before a show, or perhaps just being a little more nervous than usual. By convincing himself that these were normal problems, he could keep smiling for the cameras and continue his grueling tour schedule without having to face the truth. However, the reality became harder to ignore when he picked up his instrument. For his entire career, the guitar had felt like a natural part of his body, something he once called a handshake with destiny. But as the condition progressed, that feeling changed completely. The guitar started to feel like a heavyweight that he had to struggle to manage. His arms would get tired more quickly, and his hands had to work much harder just to hold the instrument steady. It was no longer a tool that gave him freedom. It was becoming a physical burden that reminded him of his limitations every time he touched it. He spent years trying to hide these struggles from his fans, but the symptoms were becoming too strong to keep secret. He knew he could not keep making excuses forever, and soon a single word from a doctor would change his life forever. The mystery of his health was finally solved, but the answer was much harder to hear than he ever expected. Diagnosis: Parkinson's. The clinical reality finally hit home in a doctor's office. After years of wondering why his body was changing, Neil Diamond heard the word neurological. This word refers to the brain and the nervous system. Then came the specific diagnosis: Parkinson's disease. In that moment, Neil felt as if time had completely stopped. Everything he thought he knew about his future and his strength suddenly felt fragile. Hearing the name of a permanent illness was a massive shock for a man who had always been in control. After leaving the doctor, Neil faced what felt like a betrayal of his own hands. He spent a long time just staring at his fingers and palms. These were the same hands that had written every hit song and played the guitar for thousands of hours. They were the tools he had used to build his entire life. Now, he had to accept that his hands no longer obeyed his commands. Because Parkinson's affects how the brain sends signals to the muscles, his hands would shake or become stiff against his will. It felt like his own body was turning against him, taking away the skills he had practiced since he was a young boy. Despite the fear and the physical struggle, Neil decided to carry a secret burden. He was not ready to tell the world about his illness. He worried that if people knew, they would look at him with pity instead of joy. He wanted his fans to see the legendary performer, not a patient. So, he kept the diagnosis a total secret. He continued to step in front of cameras and walk down red carpets. He forced himself to smile and act as if everything was perfect, even though his body was fighting him every single day. This required a huge amount of mental strength to manage. Even with his great strength and his secret kept safe, a single night on a famous stage would force him to finally face the truth. The pressure was building up, and it was about to reach a breaking point during one of his most famous songs. The Vegas Confession. The struggle Neil Diamond was hiding finally reached a breaking point one night in Las Vegas. He was performing for a sold-out crowd under bright lights, doing exactly what he had done for decades. But during this specific show, something changed when he began to sing his famous song, "I Am, I Said." For years, that song was just a piece of art he had created. It was a song about searching for identity and feeling lost. But that night in Vegas, the lyrics became a reborn truth. As he sang the lines about being lost and not knowing why, he realized he wasn't just performing a story anymore. He was describing his actual life. The words were no longer just a creative choice. They were a literal description of how he felt as he battled a disease that was stealing his control. The physical challenge became impossible to hide from himself while he was on stage. Usually, a singer can hold a microphone easily with one hand, but Neil found that he could no longer keep his hand steady. To stop the audience from seeing how badly he was shaking, he had to use a mic grip, where he held the microphone with both hands. He gripped it as hard as he could to keep it still. He had to focus all of his energy just to appear normal. While the audience saw a passionate performer, Neil was actually fighting a physical battle just to finish the song without dropping the equipment or showing his fear. Despite the internal chaos, the show was a success. The audience had no idea what was happening. They cheered, sang along, and waved their phones in the air. They saw the sparkle they had come for, and they went home happy. But for Neil, the end of the show brought a silent goodbye. Once he was alone in his dressing room and the door was closed, the performer's mask fell off. He sat down and cried. He wasn't crying because he was in pain, but because he knew deep down that his time on stage was coming to an end. He realized he could not keep up the act forever. It was a private, heartbreaking moment where he had to admit that the thing he loved most was slipping away. He knew he couldn't keep fighting his own body much longer, and the final signs of his career's end were moving in fast. His legs were the next thing to give out, making it clear that the battle was almost over. Fighting against gravity. The battle against Parkinson's disease eventually moved beyond Neil Diamond's hands and began to affect his entire body. He described this stage as a final struggle, where even speaking or singing felt like he was fighting against gravity. Because the disease affects muscle control, his voice started to feel heavy. Every word he sang required a massive amount of physical effort just to push the sound out of his throat. During a performance of the song Forever in Blue Jeans, the struggle became visible in his lower body. His legs began to shake uncontrollably. This was not because he was nervous or excited, but because his muscles were becoming too weak to support him under the bright stage lights. He had to stand his ground and try to stay upright while his body was telling him to stop. It was a clear sign that the disease was moving into a more difficult phase. After the show, his manager noticed how much pain and effort Neil was in. This led to a serious intervention in the dressing room. His manager gently suggested that it might be time to take a break from the road. Neil's response showed how much the stage meant to him. He realized that if he stopped touring now, he might never have the strength to come back. He was afraid that taking a break would mean the end of his identity as a performer. Finally, the situation reached a medical ultimatum. His doctors explained the hard facts about his condition. They told him that while he could still sing, the intense stress of touring was making the Parkinson's worse. The constant travel, the lack of sleep, and the pressure of performing were actually accelerating the disease. The doctors made it clear that if he wanted to protect his health, he had to stop the relentless schedule of global tours. Neil had to face a choice between his career and his physical survival. With his health at risk, Neil had to make the most difficult announcement of his entire life. The world was about to hear a word that Neil Diamond never thought he would have to use. Choosing silence. In 2020, Neil Diamond found himself in a new reality where he was no longer chasing the next big stadium tour. Instead, he ended up giving a surprise performance for a small group of firefighters in Colorado who were busy fighting dangerous wildfires near his home. There were no massive television cameras, no expensive stage lights, and no elaborate costumes. It was just Neil, his acoustic guitar, and a handful of heroes who were exhausted and covered in dirt. This small set reminded him that the true power of music is found in human connection rather than in a spectacle. As he stood there and sang Sweet Caroline, something unexpected happened to his body. For a brief moment, the shaking in his hands seemed to stop, and his voice became steady again. He realized that this was what music was always meant to be. It was heart to heart and person to person. The firefighters sang along louder than many of the crowds in the huge arenas he had played in the past. When the song ended and they clapped for him, Neil felt a sense of peace that was deeper than any applause he had ever received in a famous stadium. This experience helped him move into a phase of life where he finally accepted his pause. He stopped trying to fight against the passing of time and instead learned how to live in harmony with it. He realized that you cannot outrun time, but you can choose to be grateful for the years you have had. He began to appreciate the simple things that his fame had previously drowned out. He learned to enjoy waking up without a busy schedule, drinking his coffee slowly, and sitting in the sun. He found that there was a natural rhythm to a quiet life that was just as real as the rhythm of a hit song. Neil no longer measures his worth by how many tickets he sells or how loud a crowd cheers for him. Now, he measures his life by moments of gratitude. He has discovered that being remembered by others through his songs is a form of immortality that is much more valuable than being seen on a screen. He still sits with his guitar today, even if he cannot play it with the same speed or strength he had in the 1970s. Sometimes he just rests his hand on the strings to feel them vibrate. It is no longer a performance for the world. It is a quiet conversation between an artist and his oldest friend. He has found that while Parkinson's disease took away his steadiness and his stage, it gave him something he never had before: stillness. The silence that once scared him has become his friend, and he is happy knowing that his voice is still traveling the world through the people who love his music. Neil Diamond may have left the stage, but the music he started in Brooklyn all those years ago is far from over. Finding peace. In 2020, Neil Diamond found a new sense of purpose that had nothing to do with ticket sales or giant stadium screens. He decided to give a surprise performance for a group of firefighters in Colorado who were exhausted from fighting dangerous wildfires near his home. There were no bright spotlights, no backup singers, and no expensive stage decorations. It was just Neil and his acoustic guitar standing before a small group of people covered in dust and dirt. This simple, raw performance proved to him that music is really about the connection between people, not the fancy spectacle of a big show. As he sang with these brave men and women, he realized that a song doesn't need a massive arena to feel powerful. This small moment helped Neil finally accept the pause that had been forced upon his life by his health. For 60 years, he had lived at a very fast pace, always thinking about the next flight, the next hotel, and the next crowd of thousands. Because of his diagnosis, he had to relearn how to harmonize with time instead of constantly trying to outrun it. He stopped fighting the reality that his body was slowing down. Instead of spending his energy feeling sad about the things he could no longer do, he began to notice and appreciate the quiet moments he had ignored for decades. He found that there is a deep, natural beauty in living a life that is slower and more thoughtful. Neil also went through a major shift in how he thought about his success. He moved away from needing the roar of the crowd and started to find what he calls the music of stillness. In the past, he felt he needed the loud applause of a stadium to know he had done a good job. Now, he finds his value in the living echo of his work. He knows that even while he is sitting quietly at home, his songs are being played in kitchens, cars, and parties all over the world. This means he is still a part of people's most important memories, even if he isn't standing on a stage in front of them. Today, Neil finds a new kind of music in his daily routine. He enjoys the quiet sounds of the morning and the steady, calm rhythm of a life that no longer requires a tour schedule. He has traded the fast-paced adrenaline of being a superstar for the long-lasting comfort of personal peace. If you enjoyed this look into Neil's life, hit the like button and subscribe for more such videos. Let us know your favorite Neil Diamond song in the comments below.